This is a set of reflections at the end of another visit to Tak in 2010. I first came to Tak in the winter of 1968, just before my 27th birthday, and I'm now talking just before my 69th birthday. So almost 42 years I've been coming here, some 18 visits, over 6 years of my life spent in a Himalayan village among the Gurung people in this village. And I just wanted to put down a few thoughts about what I discovered during that time, about myself, about the Gurus, about human beings. And in fact, it's the human beings that I'll start with. One of the things that I've discovered very forcefully is that any view that human beings in different societies and civilizations are unequal in their creativity, in their intelligence, in their innate abilities is really misguided. There are historians, sociologists, others who, living in Western societies, have looked down upon the peoples who are less educated than themselves and perhaps less affluent, and thought that they were somehow inferior, deeply inferior. This might be in the present, or it might be in the past. We were uncivilized in the past. People didn't feel as we feel. Their minds were somehow inferior. From my experience of living with families and people in a relatively poor, uneducated society for 6 years of my life, I can say categorically that this is completely wrong. The children, the adults, those I've come to know very deeply over those years, have shown me that human ability and creativity are pretty uniformly distributed. There are many very intelligent people living in this village, in no way inferior to the brightest academics I meet at the great University of Cambridge. They feel exactly as we do. They feel pain, they feel sorrow, they feel happiness. They think practically and intuitively in the same way as we do in the West. There is really no deep difference. All the difference is created by material conditions such as how you earn a living, what sort of schools you have, what encouragement you get. But otherwise, humans all over the globe have been very, very equal. This is, of course, a basic lesson of anthropology, and one would have thought that by now all the many books that anthropologists have written about living in societies like this would have got the message across that people are equal, born equal. But I was amazed to find that in my own discipline of history that a theory grew up that people before the 18th century were somehow defective in their intelligence or their ability to feel deeply about human relationships. I'm glad to say this seems to have declined, but it keeps re-emerging. So I want to reaffirm on the basis of this experience that I have positively learned that there really is very little difference innately, and the capacity to love, to feel, to hate, to be amused is very, very uniform. The second reflection concerns our ability to predict the future. I suppose all of us would like to know what the future is, and some academic disciplines in their brochures, so to speak, promise the ability to tell what the future is going to be. And the more you can be assertive about your ability to do that, the more disciples you will attract. So, for instance, Marxism is very clear about the future of the world, the class society will happen, or Christians, some forms of Christians are very sure about the second coming and what will happen. And I think when I first came to TARC in 1968, my training and background had led me to believe that the social sciences, that sociology and anthropology, would give us some ability to predict. The idea was that you would look at the patterns of the past, see the trends, work out the forces at work, and then make a prediction about the future. And my first book, Resources and Population, which was about this area, or the first book about this area, made pretty strong predictions based on the theories of particularly Thomas Malthus, that in this area the population was expanding, would double within the next generation, that resources were limited, that as a result of this intersection, the people here in 20-30 years later would be facing a catastrophe. The forests would have been cut down, the soils would have been eroded, the animals could no longer be afforded, there would be a double population pressing on this resource, and as a result there would be extreme poverty, if not famine. When I came back, because I didn't come back for some years, in 1986, i.e. about 17 years later, I found that my predictions were completely wrong. They were wrong for a simple reason, and that was that I hadn't allowed for out-migration. I hadn't allowed for the fact that nearly half the people in the village had left and gone down into the towns like Pokhara. And so the forest was, if anything, slightly better when I came back, and the famine and the poverty which I had predicted had not occurred. As I keep coming back year after year over those 40 years, I keep making predictions about the future, but one of the delightful surprises when one comes back is that nearly always one's ideas about the future are not what happens. TARC is part of a huge wide world, and forces miles beyond even Nepal, like developments in technology or communications, means that it isn't possible really to predict more than a few months ahead. For instance, this time, coming back in 2010, I couldn't possibly 5 years ago have predicted that there would be electricity in the village. I thought it would be impossible to get it up to the village, too steep, and likewise that there is a road along which jeeps are coming, or likewise that there would be mobile phones. On average, each house has 2 or 3 mobile phones, and so communications with all over the world are very easy now from this village. Now, none of that could I have predicted, and it is changing everything. So, if I sat here and said, well, I think in the future it'll be like this, it's very likely that I would be completely wrong. I just can't tell. All you can do is to see the history up to now, have a few guesses, and then see how wrong you are. Something else I've learnt a little over those many years is the difficulty of helping people. When I first came, I had all sorts of schemes to do good and help these poor people by introducing new seeds or manuring systems or this or that. And over many years we have had schemes to start a store or to introduce medicine or improve communications in some way. Some of them have helped a tiny bit, and we still give what we can when we come to the schools and to the village women who try and raise money for various good schemes. But we've learnt a little bit of humility. On the whole, you can do a lot of harm through foreign aid, as it were, which we've seen. And even if you understand the village quite well, as we do, it's extremely difficult to know what would be most helpful and make people's lives better. So I've learnt a little bit of humility and realised that probably the most important thing is to treat people with some dignity, to help one or two families, to give advice when required, and then let people work out what they need to do themselves. So it isn't a lesson that fits very well with Western aid, and indeed I've become more impressed by the alternative model, which is the Chinese model of just treating other societies as your equal, trading with them, and entering into mutually agreeable contractual relations rather than the top-down model of foreign aid which has dominated the world for the last 50 years. Something else which has changed in my mind over those years is worth reflecting on. And that is the kind of theoretical models that are unexamined in one's mind when one is gathering data in a place like TARC. What I haven't realized really until recently was that when I came here, I had a training in history and some training 2 years in anthropology at the London School of Economics. But deeper down, I was a child of my time. I was a child of the end of the British Empire. So part of me, from my education and family background, as well as my formal education, was still stuck to a certain extent in a colonial imperial mould. That meant that I tended to think in a rather dual way about us and them. We were the white governors. They were the brown people whose destiny it was to be ruled by us. Now, it wasn't very strong by the time I came here. The revolutions of 1967-68 had occurred and so on. But there was still something there. So my first fieldwork had this tinge to it, combined with a methodology developed in parts of anthropology, which was that it was a scientific study and you must keep your distance from the people, and therefore you shouldn't get too close to them. There was a danger of going native, as they said. And so keep your emotional distance, keep your almost class distance from the object of study. And so my first field work was rather holding back. What I've discovered over the years is that really to understand people, you have to lower these barriers a great deal. This has become, of course, much easier. The whole world has changed, and in Britain I've seen it, whereby class and caste differences are much less strong now than they were 40 years ago. And so as part of that movement, no doubt, and part of getting to know certain families very well, coming back again and again, being more self-confident in myself, not worrying too much about the idea that I was spoiling the experiment by getting involved with people. I've learnt that it's possible to really enter into people's lives, treat them as equals, become close to them, and still, hopefully, retain a certain objectivity. We learn this in our ordinary lives. We both love and get close to people, and at the same time try and be objective about them and about their worlds and about what we observe. And so it's not so very difficult to apply this in fieldwork as well. But it does relax the situation, and it makes it much more enjoyable than a rather stiff, holding back kind of anthropology which I first became involved with. Another thing which has changed considerably is the theoretical framework within which I set whatever I discover. The training I had not only got this imperial flavour to it, but it had quite a deep, I suppose you might roughly call it, vulgar Marxist feel to it. That is to say that I believed in the idea that material conditions, the physical world, the way people earn their living, very strongly determined other things, their mentality and their morality and so on. Wasn't something I really explicitly talked about or thought about, but I think I just absorbed it. And this was made the more powerful because the major theory in dealing with societies in other parts of the world in economics and sociology was what was called developmental economics and modernization theory. And the idea here was that societies were pre-modern, and they were becoming more modern, and then they would become modern. It was a stage theory, and indeed anthropology was partly phrased and framed like this. So you would have very, very simple societies, hunters and gatherers, and then you would improve the technology and you would have tribal societies who kept animals and looked after the earth and tilled the earth in various ways, hoes and plows. And then you would have settled civilizations with more advanced crafts and technologies, and these were called peasant civilizations. And what most anthropologists were, and others were interested in, was that world of peasants moving slowly into our world of industrial societies. So this is a very stage theory which fits to a certain extent with Marxist theories and with anthropological theories. And so I placed Tak as on the border of tribal and peasant, and aiming maybe one day to be like us and be sort of capitalist industrial society. Obviously it would be very difficult in these hills to be industrial, but moving towards small petty capitalism. And that was the kind of background idea I had. Now, I can see its value, but I no longer believe in it entirely, or even much. And one defect of the theory, apart from its what's called its teleological aspect, in other words, it's aiming towards a certain final outcome, one disadvantage is that it makes everything much too uniform. You have a stage, and then that's an integrated stage. So you are peasants, and you have all the you have a domestic mode of production. In other words, the household produces and consumes most of the wealth. You have a peasant morality. You have a peasant system of government, and so on and so on. Now, and then you change to the next stage. What I've learned, which is much more interesting, is that all the time, any society, such as Tak, is a mixture of stages. You can see this now. You have very high tech. You have mobile phones, you have televisions, you have radios, you have high communications. At the same time, people are going out and gathering and pursuing agriculture with this very simplest of tools. In some ways this is very, very primitive economics here, because of the steep mountains. You don't really use the wheel even. You plough with a plough that doesn't use a wheel. You don't have wheelbarrows. Before the jeeps came up, nothing was carried or agriculture pursued using a wheel. So it's a pre-wheel technology, which is about as simple as you can get. Everything is more or less done by the human back, the human arms, and with the help of animals. No use of wind power, very little use of water power. So technologically it's very, very simple society, and yet communications-wise now, and even in the past, in terms of the fact that many of the people in the village would go off and spend a good chunk of their lives in Hong Kong or Britain or Singapore, seeing sophisticated systems, operating them, coming back and then living an apparently very, very simple life. So societies are not one thing or another, they're an enormous mixture. And this would be true anywhere. And this leads on to something which I've increasingly realized is important, and that is that there are levels or layers which change at different speeds. Often it's the surface technologies which change very rapidly. You have an industrial revolution or a communications revolution. But below that, many institutions, such as the family, or people's characters, or other things, change at a different pace, much more slowly. And so I've gradually learnt to think in a more complex way about this. And I think this ties up with something else which I've been thinking about a lot. When I went back from my first field work, about 7 years later, I sat down to write a book about English peasants. And in the back of my mind were the peasants of Tak. And I thought, well, the English were much like that once, and then they become modern industrial people. What I discovered shocked me, because I found that the English hadn't ever been peasants in the sense of having a domestic mode of production, not having markets, not having an individualistic ethic. And so I wrote The Origins of English Individualism, which shattered my own theories and attacked that of the modernization Marxist Weberian framework. That would not have been possible without coming here, so that was a huge side effect of coming to work in Tak. But it also began to set me on the course of thinking about how, while societies change hugely, medieval England changed into early colonial England, into industrial England, and yet in many respects at a deeper level, the family systems, the attitudes, the religion even, changed much, much less. So you get surface big changes, very big changes in cities and factories, but beneath the surface there is a great deal of continuity, and this was my first realization of that. much later, I came to work in Japan and visited a number of times, and I gathered together my ideas finally on Japan in a book on reflections on the Japanese mirror through the looking glass. And there, finally, I also realized that the secret of understanding Japan is that it is constantly changing, very modern looking, and yet the deep note, as one great Japanese sociologist, Maruyama, has put it, basso ostinato, the deep note of Japanese culture has remained relatively unchanged for thousands of years, maybe. So if you distinguish the deep note, what anthropologists call the habitus, the generative dispositions which tell people who they are, how they should behave, what they are, from the surface manifestations and technological changes. If you distinguish those, then England and Japan are very long and continuous civilizations. This time, coming back to this village, I've realized that this is also true of Tak. One thing that I had become somewhat sad about in my last visit and in previous visits, and I had written a little bit about, was the disappearance of Gurung culture. It is true that in a village like this, 20 years ago, much of what I took for granted in my first visit, in other words, the shaman who lived in the village, the Podju, the youth dormitories, the rodi, the great dance that they do, the gato sheba, the singing in the evening, many of the small rituals, even the Gurung language, all that was rapidly disappearing, or had disappeared, and gone off to Pokhara. And it is true that the village now is no longer really the village I came to. Very few Gurungs, very little Gurung culture, in inverted commas. And this made me sad. What I've realized, though, is that, in a sense, this is part of a long history and tradition of the Gurungs, and of many peoples, whereby they move, they change, but they don't lose everything, but they retain it in another form. The Gurungs started, some people say, as fishermen on the edge of a lake in China, perhaps something before that. So they were hunter-gatherer fishers, and this is 3,000-4,000 years ago. Then they moved out of China across Tibet, and they became shepherds. So they changed their mode of production, but they were still Gurungs of a kind. They then came down to the high hills in this region, and they became slash and burn cultivators of maize and millet and buckwheat, but keeping also herds of animals and flocks of sheep. Each time their technology and ecology changed, and yet they preserved a great deal of their culture. They then came down from those higher ridges down into this area, and they became rice farmers, and so sort of peasants, and at the same time sending their sons off to the armies, so wage labourers, and that was another huge change. So when I came for the first time, that was the stage they were in, and each had been a big transformation. In the last 40 years there has been another huge transformation. They have stopped being hill farmers on the whole, and they have gone down into the towns and cities, and they now go in very large numbers to Britain, to the UK and elsewhere. But when you visit them in their homes in Pokhara or in London or wherever it is, and meet with them and talk with them, they haven't changed They do different jobs. They have much better education for their children. They watch television much more, and so on and so on. And they don't do the same things necessarily. But in many senses they are the same people. Their sense of humour, their cultural attitudes, even their religion. They have many shamans and rituals, their death rituals. They've preserved much of their culture while living in the middle of cities and towns around the world. So there is now a dispersed village. In England there is a gurung, or a village committee named after this village, of people from this village, and each village has produced one of these in England. So there are hundreds of these, and they eat gurung food, they eat with their hands, they keep closely in touch with their relatives back in Nepal and even in the village. And so they have spread like the overseas Chinese or many other cultures, but they haven't stopped being what they were before. So it isn't a loss, it's a transformation. And so there is the sadness I felt. Even in terms of language, though there has been a lot of language loss, there is now a lot of interest in learning gurung. There are schemes. UNESCO has set up a scheme in eastern Nepal to teach gurung. So there may be a resurgence of the language to a certain extent. They're very keen also to document and write down their traditions and history, and they've started an excellent cultural centre and religious centre, the Koimbo in Pokhara, the Tamil Pye Lusang, which means the Gurung cultural centre. And so there's interest in it and preservation and maintenance, and they teach their children about Gurung traditions. So it is change. Everything is changing all the time, but it is the same. So these three examples of England over many centuries, of Japan over many centuries. And so I think sociology in general has forgotten the power of culture, which anthropologists always stress. But anthropologists tend, like sociologists, to do a single time study. And it's really only if you do a long-term study, like the 40 years I've done here, or long historical studies, that you can see both the continuities of culture, its power and its importance. So I've learned so much from coming here about other people, and also about my own limitations, and I have received so much reward from those 6 years spent here. So now as I go back to England to try to understand what I've learned, I would like to pay a tribute to the people who have given me so much and who I admire so greatly.